Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, and in this video we are sewing the second part of the three-piece series for New Look 6035. This time we are sewing the skirt, which is view D. So let's go ahead and talk supplies. Okay, let's go ahead and talk the supplies that you will need in order to construct your skirt. You will need, there's only 4 pattern pieces that you will need, which is pattern piece number 16, 17, 18, and 19. So the first one is pattern piece number 16, which is your front and back. You need to cut 2 on the fold of fabric. You'll also need pattern piece number 17, which is your yoke front. You need to cut 2 on the fold of fabric and cut 1 on the fold of interfacing. You'll also need pattern piece number 18, which is your yoke back. You need to cut 2 on the fold of fabric and cut 1 on the fold of interfacing. And the last pattern piece that you will need is pattern piece number 19, which is your carrier piece. You only need to cut 1. So you only need to cut 1 single layer of this piece. And this is optional if you want belt loops. Now that I talked about the pattern pieces, and I am using royal blue twill fabric just in case you are interested in wanting to know entirely what fabric I am using. So now let's go ahead and talk supplies. Clearly the first thing that you will need is the pattern and the pattern instructions. Always have the pattern instruction handy just in case you need to look and see what's the next step. Another thing that you will need is a pair of scissors. I have 1 for fabric, 1 for paper. You should never mix the 2. I like to cut my fabric with rotary cutters, so I have 1 for paper, 1 for fabric. I never mix the 2. I also have some marking tool. This is a disappearing ink marker and some chalk. I also have a seam ripper just in case I need to rip out the seams if I make a mistake. I have a point turner to poke out my corners. And then I'm also using 2 rulers. I have this ruler right here and a hip curve ruler because I have to make an adjustment to my hips. I also have some pattern weights, which is just large washers that I picked up from my local home improvement store. I have a zipper. Now you only need a 7 to 9 inch zipper. Mine is a little longer and I will cut it off at the end. But this is the only color that I have to match my pants. And then I have some pens. So that's all the supplies that you need to get started and do this skirt. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So grab pattern piece number 16, which is your front and back for your skirt. And like I said, this is New Look 6035. Where you cut 2 on the fold of fabric. Now I am using a size 16, but I had to enlarge the hip area because my hips fall outside of this pattern piece. I'll do a video on that at a later time. But grab pattern piece number 16, which is your front and your back. And the first thing I did was went ahead and searched the side seams of my skirt. So I like to do that before I start, but you do not have to. So you could go ahead and search the side seams if you would like at this time. After you do that, you're going to stay stitch the upper part of your skirt. So start at the center, go to one side, then start back at the center and go to the other side. You do not want to do it all in one continuous seam. And stay stitching prevents your skirt from stretching out of shape while we construct the skirt. So you do not want to skip out on stay stitching. After you do that, pin right sides together. You're going to pin both side seams and using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end. So go ahead and sew using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, I'm going to back stitch at the beginning and at the end. So needle down, presser foot down, begin, back stitch. And when you get to your pins, make sure you pull your pennants out. Now back stitch at the end. Now do the other side seam the same way. Okay, so now that you have stitched your side seams together, I advise you to go ahead and try it on now. Reason being is because you do not want to continuously construct the skirt and then when you get to your waistband, it doesn't fit. So go ahead, try your skirt on, and if it's too big, 1/4 of an inch on each side. So sew 1/4 of an inch in and then sew 1/4 of an inch on each side. Now, what I had to do was, it was too big for me, so I sewed 1/4 of an inch on both sides and it took care of it and it was fine. So now that you have sewn your side seams together, go ahead and put your skirt aside and grab your yoke front and back pieces. That's pattern piece number 17 and 18. Now I labeled mine front and back. And you want to grab the ones that have interfacing on it. And you can move the other ones out of the way. So you're going to take one front to one back, right sides together, and you're going to sew the right side seams, which is this side. So when you put front to back, right sides together, you're going to sew the side seams right here. So you're going to pin. And using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end and press your seams open. Now we're going to sew using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end. Now press your seams open. Now that you have done your yoke pieces, go ahead and put that aside. And grab piece number 19, which is your carrier. And what you're going to do is fold it lengthwise in half. You're going to press it with wrong sides together. You're going to open it and press in half, both sides, and then fold it over. So let's go to the ironing board and do that. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is with wrong sides together, you want to fold over and press. Then open it out, open it back up, and then you're going to fold one side in and press. Do that to the other side as well. Fold the other side in and press. And then fold it over one last time and press. Now you're going to sew this edge right here using about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end. Okay, we're going to stitch close to both sides of the long edge, so back stitch at the beginning. And you're going to sew all the way to the end. Now back stitch. Now sew the other side the same way. Okay, so now that you have your carrier completed, now what you're going to do is cut it in 4 equal parts. So what I'm going to do is fold my carrier in half and cut. And then I'm going to fold it in half again. Both of them together. Fold it in half. And then I'm going to cut again at the fold. Now I have 4 equal parts. Now grab your yoke piece. Now you probably cannot see this on mine, so I'm just going to, I can see it, but you probably can't. So you should have some dots. So I'm going to turn mine over to show you where my dots are. Right there, here, here, and here. Now I'm going to get a marking tool so you can see it on the right side, but that's where you're going to pin your carriers. Okay, so I have went ahead and marked where my carriers will go because I have a darker color fabric. So what you want to do is take one of your carriers and you're going to pin at the bottom where your marking is. So take a pin and pin at the bottom. And you're going to do that for each one of your carrier pieces. Now you just want to base across the bottom of each one of your carrier pieces. Okay, so now that you have went ahead and basted on your carrier pieces, go ahead and grab your skirt. So I have labeled my skirt front and back because I want my zipper on the left hand side. So one correction, I do want to tell you that if you sewn your seam on one side, your side seam, all the way up, make sure you take that stitching out because where your notch is, you need it to leave that portion open. So go ahead and rip those seams out on one side seam where your notch is all the way up to the top. So now that I made that correction, go ahead and grab your yoke. And I'm going to start at my side seam and pin. So like I said, your side seam should have been pressed open. So make sure you matching up your side seam and make sure your yoke is frowning, meaning that you have that piece down and you're going to pin. And then match up your notches. Now that you have it all pinned, you're going to start at the side seam and go all the way around one way, and then start back at the side seam and go the opposite direction. Back stitch at the beginning and at the end. Okay, using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, we're going to back stitch at the beginning and the end. Back stitch. Do the other side the same way. So just turn it over, start at the back seam and sew the opposite direction. All right, now that you have sewn your yoke piece onto your skirt, turn your skirt wrong side out. Now before you do that, make sure that you trim your seam allowance down to about 1/4 of an inch and press your seams up towards your yoke. Now, I am doing an invisible zipper. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is, I think that a lap zipper on the side is a little weird to me. So I'm not doing that. I'm going to do the invisible zipper. So what I'm going to do is pin my side seam. Now I want my my invisible zipper on the left hand side. So whatever side that you chose, just pin your side seam. Now make sure that you are lining up your seams. Now, one thing you don't want is your zipper looking like this. So make sure that you line this seam right here to that seam. Make sure it is lined up perfectly, because you want those seam lines to be spot on, and pin. And you're going to pin all the way up the seam. Now go to your sewing machine and, using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, base this seam from backstitch at, you don't have to backstitch at the beginning or at the end. That is completely up to you, but I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and not at the end. Okay, so we're going to base this using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. We're going to backstitch at the beginning and sew all the way down until you meet your existing stitch. And also make sure that while you're stitching, your seams are matching up and pushed up towards your yoke. Just keep checking. And I'm just going to go ahead and backstitch again. Now press your seams open. Okay, so now that I have sewn my zipper section together and pressed the seams open where the zipper is going to be, now I have a 22-inch zipper because this is the only one that matches the color of my fabric. So I'm going to put the bottom right on the seam line. And I'm just going to pin one side, not through the skirt, just one side. And I'm going to pin just one side seam, just within the seam allowance. So now I'm going to go to the sewing machine, just sewing on the seam allowance, base close to the edge. Okay, so I'm going to change out my regular foot for my zipper foot. And I'm just using a regular zipper foot. This is not the invisible zipper foot. It's just a regular one that came with my machine. So just using one side of the seam allowance, just make sure the rest of the skirt is out of your way. And I'm going to start at the top. Now I'm going to slow my speed down because I want to get as close as possible without sewing on my zipper teeth. So just slow it down, and I'm going to backstitch, and make sure you're using a basting stitch. Now backstitch and do the same thing to the other side. And backstitch. Okay, so now that you have sewn, you basted your zipper to your skirt. Now take your seam ripper and you're going to open up the basting stitches. So just start where you ended and be very careful not to rip your fabric. Now clean up your threads and open up your zipper. Do not cut off your zipper. Okay, so back at the sewing machine, we're going to sew close to the zipper teeth using a regular length stitch. You're going to backstitch. Now you want to pull open the coils of your zipper, just a little at a time. And if you need to move your zipper up, you can do so. I don't need to. Now back stitch. And do the other side the same way. Do not cut off your zipper. Now that your zipper is finished, go ahead and put your skirt aside and grab your yoke facing pieces. That's pattern piece 16 and 17. And then, like I told you before, I labeled mine's front and back. So with right sides together, so that is the front down, and then put your back on top of your front. And you're going to stitch using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance on the right side of your yoke facing piece. So just pin, and using a regular length stitch, 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end. Okay, so now that I have sewn right sides together, my yoke facing piece. Now, if you want your zipper on the right hand side versus the left hand side, all you have to do is put your back piece down, front piece on top of your back, and sew the right side seam. So it's just the opposite of what I just did. So after you sew your yoke facing pieces and press them open, you're going to go ahead and create a stitching line. So using a long stitch on your sewing machine, I'm using a 4.0, a basting stitch. Using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, I'm just going to create a stitching line. And make sure you are stitching on the side that does not have the notch. So the unnotched side. I'm sorry, the notched side. Okay, so now that you have created that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, now what you can do is you could turn it under. You have a couple of options if you did not want to create that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance to turn under and press to give a nice clean finish. You can just go ahead and edge stitch this with your, use your serger, zigzag stitch, pinking shears. If you do not have a serger, you can do any of those. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to press this up. That's why I created that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, to give a nice clean finish. Okay, so now that I have pressed the edge up, go ahead and grab your skirt. And with right sides together, you want to pin your yoke facing to your skirt. So I'm going to pin my side seams. I'm going to pin there first, and I'm going to pin all the way around. And go ahead and pin all the way to the end. And you'll cut any extension off after you sew it together. And do the same thing to the other side. Okay, and just like the other side, make sure that you open out your zipper and pin. Now it's okay if it's extending past your zipper. You'll cut all the extension off after you sew it together. So using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end. Now I'm going to start at my side seam. I'm going to start at my side seam, go one direction, and then start back at the side seam and go the opposite direction, back stitching at the beginning and at the end. Okay, using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, we're going to back stitch at the beginning and at the end, making sure that you are at the side seam and sewing in one continuous stitch one way, and then we're going to turn it around and sew in the opposite direction. So I'm going to back stitch, and I'm going to sew all the way to the end. Once you clear the zipper, go ahead and back stitch. Do the other side the same way. And as you get closer to the zipper, go ahead and stitch very slowly so you do not break a needle. Clear the zipper, back stitch. Now go ahead and trim your seams. Now that we have attached the yoke facing to the yoke, you could go ahead and trim off your zipper. This is the reason why you do not want to cut your zipper off early, because it will completely come off the pull. Now what you're going to do is go ahead and trim your seam allowance. Now if you had some excess like I had, you could go ahead and trim it off because you're not going to need it. So I'm going to trim off my excess. And then I'm going to go ahead and trim this down to about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Now that I have trimmed it, I'm going to press the seam allowance up towards the facing. After you do that, we're going to understitch. So make sure that your seam allowance is facing your yoke, and you're going to understitch at about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, understitch to where it'll turn nice. All right, so using a regular length stitch, and I am about 1/2 inch away from the zipper, so do not start at the beginning. You're going to go in about 1/2 inch past the zipper. Put your presser foot down and your needle in, and we're going to back stitch and sew all the way to the end. Now I want to make sure that your facing is up towards the yoke facing. So your seams is up towards the yoke facing, not towards the skirt. And understitch all the way around. Now that I'm about 1/2 inch away from the zipper, I'm going to back stitch. Okay, so what we're going to do after understitching, you're going to finish off the zipper area. So what you want to do is match up, keep this part folded, match it up. And I'm going to go ahead and put some pins right there. And what you want to do is make sure you are sewing close to your zipper teeth, but do not sew on your zipper teeth. So all I'm going to do is match it up right here. And I do not want to sew on my zipper teeth. So if you need a pin, go ahead and put a pin in it, but that's completely up to you. And I'm going to sew close, about 1/2 inch away. I'm going to put my zipper down. I'm sorry, my needle down and my presser foot down. And I'm going to sew really slow because I do not want to sew on my zipper teeth. So I'm going to back stitch. And like I said, I'm sewing as close as I possibly can to the zipper teeth, but I'm not sewing through the zipper teeth. Now that I'm ending up at the end, I'm going to back stitch. And I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. Okay, so now that you have finished off your zipper area, do not trim it yet. Because what you want to do is poke it out, turn it right side out on both sides. And this is where I like to check to see if they're matching up. So therefore, what you want to do is go ahead and zip up your skirt. And make sure one side is not higher than the other side. If it is, you need to go back in and fix it. So mine is looking nice and polished. So I'm going to go ahead and unzip it. Now I'm going to turn it right side out again. I'm sorry, wrong side out. And I'm going to trim the corners. Now I want to make sure I am not clipping my stitching. So I'm going to clip that corner and then I'm going to turn it right side out to remove some of that bulk. So I'm going to do that on both sides and then zip it up. Okay, so now that I have clipped off the corners, making sure not to clip my stitching, I'm going to go ahead and turn my corners out. And if you have a point turner, go ahead and poke out your corners on both sides and then try to zip it up to see if one side is taller than the other. You don't want that. You want a nice clean finish, and mine is nicely finished and one side is not higher than the other. So now what you're going to do is go ahead and press your seam allowance up towards your yoke facing, and you're going to either slip stitch this closed. You could use a needle and slip stitch it closed, or you could pin on the right side and sew close to the stitching. Now I'm going to slip stitch mine with a hand needle, and I'm going to do that off camera. So I'm just going to make sure that this folded edge right here is a just very close to that stitching right here. So you want to make sure it's very close to the stitching. Just make sure that it laps over about 1/8 of an inch and slip stitch that close. Or you could sew on the right side. Like I said, I'm going to use a hand needle. So after you do that, you're going to finish off your carrier pieces. So you could base 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and then fold it in on that stitching line and then sew it shut. So you're going to fold it 5/8 of an inch, and then you're going to sew using a regular length stitch as close to the edge as possible to finish those off. So you're going to finish off all 4 of those, pressing in 5/8 of an inch and then finishing off and tacking it in place. After you do that, you're going to try your skirt on and then you're going to hem it. So finish off the raw edges of your hem, and then however long or short you want. Now I am only going to I'm going to serge it and do a 5/8 of an inch hem allowance. Now I believe the instruction calls for a narrow hem. You could do that if you want. So you could do a 5/8 of an inch basting stitch around, press to the basting stitch, and then fold it in again to create a narrow stitch. But I am going to serge it first and then just press up 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. After you do all that, you are completely done. All right, so we are all done with our skirt. I'm going to go ahead and put up some pictures. So like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, keep sewing.